Queen Camilla accused a royal guard of disrespecting her and slapped him across the face in front of 200 of the world's most powerful people. But this guard wasn't guilty of what she claimed. And when the king finally rose from his seat, what happened next didn't just clear the guard's name, it changed the monarchy forever. Now, before we reveal exactly what the king said in that moment, make sure you're subscribed to our channel Guard What, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, because what you're about to discover will shake you to your core. The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace possessed a weight that pressed into your chest the moment you stepped inside. Crystal chandeliers hung suspended from gilded ceilings, their faceted drops throwing golden light across walls lined with mirrors that had reflected centuries of power. Tonight, that weight felt heavier than usual. The long dining table stretched beneath arrangements of silver candelabras, each flame burning steadily in the presence of ceremony. Violins traced soft melodies from the gallery above, mingling with the measured clink of crystal and the low murmur of diplomatic conversation. France's delegation occupied the northern side, their navy sashes and medals catching light. Across from them, Britain's finest, cabinet ministers, military officers, cultural figures whose names appeared in history books. Every seat held someone whose presence had been calculated. Waiters moved with precision, appearing and disappearing between courses. Conversations rose and fell in careful waves, French and English phrases mixing over the tablecloth like diplomatic music. And at the eastern side of the royal dais, standing as motionless as carved marble, was Corporal James Ainsley of the Coldstream Guards. Even in a room filled with power, he drew the eye. 6 feet of rigid discipline wrapped in scarlet wool that glowed under the chandeliers, brass buttons polished to mirror brightness. A pale scar traced his jawline, a souvenir from Helmand province that had claimed 3 of his mates. His body bore marks that came from serving, where protocol meant staying alive, not standing pretty. James understood the difference between ceremony and reality better than most in that glittering hall. The weight of the rifle in his hands was familiar, comforting even, though tonight it held no ammunition. His feet knew the precise angle of attention, his shoulders the exact set required for ceremonial bearing. But his eyes, those retained the watchfulness that had kept him breathing through 3 tours in Afghanistan. What puzzled him was his placement tonight. Guards typically stood outside such occasions, sentinels against whatever threats the darkness might harbour. Rarely were they positioned inside, close enough to hear the clink of silverware and catch fragments of conversation about trade agreements and cultural exchanges. Yet here he stood, less than 20 feet from where the King and Queen Consort presided over Britain's most important dinner of the season. The assignment had come down through channels with unusual specificity, not simply ceremonial detail, but interior placement, eastern dais, full duration. No explanation, no context, just orders that placed him where he could observe everything while appearing to watch nothing. He had no way of knowing that to Queen Camilla, his presence felt like an accusation. She had noticed him early before the first course arrived, before the French ambassador launched into his prepared remarks about centuries of friendship between their nations. Every time she lifted her crystal glass, every time she leaned toward a minister to whisper some observation, she could feel his gaze. Not watching her directly, his discipline was too perfect for that, but positioned where her movement would inevitably cross his line of sight. It unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite name. There was something about the way he stood that reminded her of judgments she preferred not to recall, of questions she had spent years ensuring would never be asked in public. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper as she leaned toward the aide seated 2 places down. Why is he positioned there? The aide, a career diplomat named Morrison who had survived 3 different royal households by knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, followed her gaze carefully. Ceremonial detail, Your Majesty. The household division requested additional interior presence for tonight's dinner. Additional presence. The words came out clipped, sharp. It appears to me that he's watching. Morrison said nothing. 30 years of service had taught him that some observations were better left unacknowledged, especially when they came wrapped in the particular tension he now heard in the Queen Consort's voice. Across the table, King Charles was deep in conversation with the French ambassador, sharing a story about a vineyard from his youth. His voice carried that warmth he reserved for moments when diplomacy required genuine charm. He spoke of morning light through grape leaves, conversations about soil and weather patterns. It was the kind of story that made foreign dignitaries feel they were glimpsing something authentic, exactly the effect Charles intended. He did not notice the growing rigidity in his wife's posture, or the way her responses to nearby conversation had grown increasingly mechanical. His attention remained fixed on building the kind of rapport that would smooth tomorrow's negotiations about cultural exchange programs and joint environmental initiatives. James, however, noticed everything. Years of reading tension in rooms where misreading could prove fatal had honed senses that most civilians never developed. The Queen Consort's discomfort was as visible to him as smoke signal, though he gave no outward sign of awareness. His body remained locked in the perfect stillness of ceremonial duty, but his peripheral vision tracked the increasing frequency of her glances, the way her fingers drummed silently against her water glass, the tightness around her eyes that suggested something more than diplomatic stress. He had seen that particular combination of irritation and unease before, usually in people who believed they were being observed by someone who knew more than they were comfortable with. The recognition troubled him, though he couldn't have explained why. His role here was purely ceremonial, a reminder of tradition, a symbol of continuity, nothing more. Yet the feeling persisted that his presence meant something different to her than it did to anyone else in the room. Something that went beyond protocol, beyond the usual relationship between royal family and household staff. Something that made her see threat where others saw tradition. The first course concluded without incident. Silver plates disappeared as smoothly as they had arrived, replaced by crystal bowls containing what appeared to be a delicate consommé, garnished with herbs that had probably been grown in the palace gardens. The French delegation made appreciative sounds. The British ministers nodded approvingly. Everything proceeded according to the careful choreography that governed such occasions. But beneath the surface civility, something was building pressure like steam in a sealed vessel. By the time the second course arrived, Camilla's discomfort had progressed beyond irritation. Her responses to conversation had grown perfunctory, her smile increasingly forced. She found herself glancing toward the eastern wall with frequency that drew curious looks from other guests. The French ambassador's wife, seated 3 places away, leaned toward her companion with a kind of whispered observation that would later be repeated in diplomatic circles. The Queen Consort seems rather tense this evening. It was the sort of comment that diplomatic spouses were trained to notice and file away, the kind of detail that might prove relevant in future negotiations. James remained motionless, but his trained awareness picked up the subtle changes in room dynamics. Conversations that had flowed naturally during the first hour were becoming stilted, forced. Guests were beginning to notice the tension radiating from the royal table, though most were too diplomatic to acknowledge it directly. He had witnessed similar moments in military settings, the building pressure before situations spiraled beyond control. Usually there were warning signs, opportunities for de-escalation. But here, surrounded by crystal and ceremony, the normal safety valves seemed absent. Protocol demanded that everyone maintain perfect composure, regardless of underlying tensions. That protocol was about to be tested in ways none of them anticipated. The third course had just been served when Camilla's composure finally cracked. It began subtly, a sharper than necessary clink as she set down her fork, a glance toward James that lasted several seconds too long. The French Minister of Culture was in the middle of an anecdote about renovating chateaux, his words floating over the table in accented English that normally would have commanded polite attention. But Camilla was no longer listening to him or anyone else. Her focus had narrowed to the scarlet figure who stood with such perfect stillness that he might have been carved from stone. his unwavering discipline, his refusal to fidget or shift or acknowledge the growing tension she was broadcasting. All of it struck her as a kind of insolence, a silent challenge to her authority. Her breathing grew shallow, her hands gripping the edge of the table with increasing force. Around her the dinner continued its stately progression, but she felt increasingly disconnected from it, as though the civilized veneer was something she was watching from outside. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the ambient conversation like a blade through silk. "You." The single word carried across the marble and gold with startling clarity. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The string quartet in the gallery continued for several more notes before trailing into bewildered silence. Every head in the ballroom turned to follow the line of her gaze until they found the motionless figure in scarlet who had become the unexpected focus of international attention. James did not react. His body remained locked in perfect ceremonial bearing, gaze fixed ahead, as though the Queen Consort's voice was simply another element of the evening's ambient sound. Years of military discipline had taught him that stillness was often the highest form of response, that dignified silence could diffuse situations that words would only inflame. But his very stillness seemed to infuriate her further. "You are staring at me," she said, her voice rising above the hushed room. "Do you think that's protocol, Corporal?" A collective intake of breath rippled across the assembled guests. Foreign dignitaries exchanged glances that would be passed by intelligence services for weeks to come. British officials found themselves suddenly fascinated by their plates, unwilling to be seen, witnessing what felt like a breakdown in real time. James maintained his silence. To respond would be to break the discipline that defined not just his role, but his identity. The scarlet uniform he wore represented 3.5 centuries of unbroken service, of soldiers who had stood at attention while empires rose and fell around them. He would not be the one to break that chain. His silence, however, only seemed to pour fuel on whatever fire was burning inside her. Camilla's chair scraped against the marble floor as she leaned forward, her voice pitched with increasing frustration. "Well, I asked you a question. Do you intend to ignore me in my own hall?" The French ambassador dabbed at his lips with his napkin, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes alert, with the kind of attention diplomats reserved for moments that might require careful reporting to their governments. Several ministers cast desperate glances toward Charles, hoping he might intervene before the situation deteriorated further. But the king remained focused on his plate, his expression a study in studied neutrality. His fingers found the stem of his wineglass and gripped it with just enough force to whiten his knuckles, but he made no move to interrupt or redirect. Whether from shock, calculation, or simple paralysis, he allowed the moment to continue building its own terrible momentum. James held his position with the kind of absolute stillness that could only come from years of practice. In Afghanistan, he had learned to stand motionless for hours while snipers tested his patience and discipline. He had endured the particular agony of remaining at attention while explosions echoed in the distance, and he couldn't know if his mates were alive or dead. This was different, more personal, more humiliating, but the principle remained the same: endurance without response, dignity without retaliation. The kind of quiet strength that had made the Brigade of Guards legendary throughout the world. But his very composure seemed to drive Camilla towards some kind of breaking point. She rose from her chair with enough force to send it scraping backward across the polished floor. The sound was harsh, jarring, completely at odds with the careful grace that usually characterized such occasions. Several guests actually flinched at the noise. "I will not be disrespected like this," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast room. "Not by a soldier who cannot even follow simple bearing protocol." Her heels clicked sharply against marble as she stepped away from the table, each sound echoing through the suddenly silent hall like gunshots. With every step, she seemed to be crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed, moving toward a confrontation that would reshape not just the evening, but relationships that had been decades in the making. The 200 most powerful people in Britain and France sat frozen, uncertain whether they were witnessing history being made or simply watching the monarchy destroy itself in real time. The moment felt balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip into chaos with the slightest additional pressure. James remained exactly where he had stood for the past 2 hours, but now his stillness carried a different weight. He was no longer simply a ceremonial figure. He had become the fixed point around which everything else was spinning towards some inevitable collision. The Queen Consort was moving toward him with the kind of focused intensity that made it clear this was no longer about protocol or ceremony or diplomatic niceties. This had become personal in ways that went far deeper than anyone in the room could understand. And still, James did not move. Camilla closed the distance between them, with steps that seemed to echo through the vast chamber like hammer blows. Her face was flushed now, composed elegance replaced by something rawer and more desperate. The diplomatic mask she had worn for years was slipping, revealing emotions that protocol had been designed to contain. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that the scent of her perfume mixed with the formal atmosphere of ceremony and state. Close enough that everyone in the ballroom could see her chest rising and falling with breaths that came too quickly, too shallow. "You will acknowledge me," she said, her voice pitched low, but carrying clearly in the profound silence. "You will show respect." James remained motionless. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, looking through rather than at her, maintaining the kind of perfect military bearing that had been drilled into him through years of parade ground discipline. The scar along his jaw stood out pale against his weathered skin, a reminder of service that went far beyond ceremonial duty. The hall waited. Ministers held their breath. Foreign dignitaries leaned forward in their seats. Even the serving staff along the walls seemed frozen in place, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after the evening ended. Still, James gave her nothing. No words, no acknowledgement, no break in the composure that defined his role. His silence wasn't defiance, it was duty, the kind of absolute obedience to protocol that made the household division the most respected ceremonial unit in the world. But to Camilla, struggling with emotions she couldn't quite name or control, his stillness felt like the deepest form of insolence. His very refusal to break, to bend, to acknowledge her authority seemed designed to humiliate her in front of the people whose respect she needed most. Her hand rose almost without conscious thought, trembling slightly, with the force of whatever was driving her toward this moment. The gesture was visible to everyone in the room, unmistakable in its intent, and then it fell. The sound of palm meeting flesh cracked across the marble like a pistol shot, sharp, sudden, reverberating off walls until the vast space fell into complete silence. James's head turned slightly with the impact, but he straightened immediately, resuming his exact posture. The mark of her hand bloomed red against his scar, but his expression never changed. His eyes remained fixed ahead, his body locked in perfect military bearing. It was that immediate return to stillness, that refusal to be broken even by physical assault, that transformed everything. In that single moment, the balance of power in the room shifted completely. Camilla stood trembling, her hands still raised, looking suddenly small and unsteady despite her position. And James, unmarked by anything except the physical evidence of what she had done, radiated the kind of quiet dignity that no strike could diminish. The collective gasp that swept through the guests carried something more than shock. It was the sound of people witnessing an institution being damaged before their eyes. Foreign diplomats would file reports about this moment. Ministers would whisper about it in Parliament corridors. But the most important reaction came from the man who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation. King Charles sat absolutely still for a heartbeat longer, as though processing what he had just witnessed. His knuckles were white, where they gripped the edge of the table, his jaw clenched with visible tension. Then, with the kind of deliberate movement that made it clear he was making a conscious choice, he placed both palms flat on the table and began to rise. The sound of his chair moving backward seemed unnaturally loud in the breathless silence. Every eye in the ballroom shifted from the confrontation to the sovereign who was finally, inevitably, going to be forced to choose sides in a conflict that would reshape the monarchy's future. When Charles spoke, his voice carried the weight of 300 years of royal authority. "Corporal," he said, his tone measured but unmistakably stern, "what is your duty here tonight?" The question cut through the tension like a blade, forcing everyone to confront what had just occurred. This wasn't about protocol or ceremony anymore. This was about the fundamental relationship between the crown and those who served it, about dignity and respect and the limits of acceptable behaviour. James responded immediately, his voice clear and strong, despite everything that had just happened. "To guard without fear, Your Majesty, to serve without favour, and to endure insult without answer, unless my king commands it." The words rang through the vast chamber with the force of absolute truth. They weren't just military protocol. They were a statement of principle that exposed the reality of what everyone had just witnessed. James had done nothing wrong. His silence had been duty, his restraint discipline, his endurance honour. Charles nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged not just the words but the man who had spoken them. "Well said, Corporal." Only then did he turn his attention to his wife. Camilla stood frozen where the confrontation had left her, her face cycling through emotions too complex for the diplomatic audience to pass. Shame, defiance, fear, and anger warred visibly in her expression as she realized that her husband was not going to support her, was not going to excuse what she had done as justified or necessary. When Charles spoke again, his voice carried across the ballroom with unmistakable finality. "It is the crown that commands respect," he said, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood they would be quoted for decades to come, not the person who forgets its dignity. The rebuke landed like a physical blow. Gasps rippled through the assembled guests. Foreign dignitaries who would report this moment to their governments, ministers who would whisper about it in Parliament, military officers who would discuss it in mess halls across the Commonwealth. This wasn't private family drama anymore. This was constitutional crisis playing out before the world. Camilla's lips parted as though to respond, but Charles raised his hand sharply, cutting off whatever she might have said. "Enough," he said, steel replacing warmth in his tone. "This guard has shown more restraint in one moment than you have managed in the full course of this evening." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Every person in that room understood the comparison being drawn. The Queen Consort, who had lost control and struck a soldier, versus the Guardsman, who had maintained perfect discipline even under assault. James remained at attention, but his vindication was visible to everyone present. He had endured public humiliation with dignity, had absorbed physical attack without retaliation, had embodied everything the monarchy claimed to represent, while the Queen Consort had revealed everything it sought to transcend. The silence stretched, pregnant with implications that would reshape relationships throughout the British establishment. Then Charles delivered the final blow, the words that would be remembered long after the dinner plates were cleared and the guests had returned home. "You will retire from this hall at once." The command struck the assembled audience like thunder. For the king to publicly dismiss his consort, to order her away in front of foreign dignitaries and government ministers, was beyond unprecedented. It was the kind of constitutional moment that would be analysed by historians and constitutional scholars for generations. Camilla's face went through a series of transformations. Disbelief giving way to humiliation, humiliation to anger, anger to the terrible realization that she had no choice but to comply. To resist now would be to complete her own destruction, to confirm every whispered doubt about her fitness for the role she had spent decades trying to claim. Her chair scraped harshly against marble as she stood, the sound jarring in the profound quiet. Two attendants appeared, as if from nowhere, their faces carefully neutral masks as they moved to her side. Without a word, because what could possibly be said in such a moment, they guided her toward the side entrance. The click of her heels against the polished floor echoed with each step, growing fainter as she moved away from the royal table, away from the confrontation that had defined her, away from the husband who had chosen duty over loyalty. The sound seemed to carry with it the death of whatever authority she had imagined herself to possess. When the doors closed behind her, with a soft but final click, the silence that remained felt different. Not empty, but filled with the weight of judgment rendered and justice served. The monarchy had been tested, had bent almost to breaking, but had ultimately chosen honour over convenience, principle over politics. Charles remained standing, his presence now dominating the vast chamber, in a way it hadn't before the confrontation began. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone who had just demonstrated that the crown still meant something, still stood for values that transcended personal ambition or political calculation. The household division stands as the living face of our honour, he said, his words carrying to every corner of the ballroom. They are the unbroken line between our history and our duty. To strike them is to strike at the crown itself. That is something I will never permit, not from friend, not from foe, not even from within these walls. It was both vindication and warning, spoken not just to the room but to the institution itself. The message was clear. The monarchy would protect those who served it with honour, regardless of rank or relationship. Finally his gaze returned to James, who had stood through it all with the kind of dignity that no assault could diminish. "Corporal," Charles said, his tone carrying warmth for the first time since the confrontation began, "your bearing tonight honours not only your regiment, but your king." James brought his hand up in a perfect salute, the gesture crisp and immediate. But beneath the military precision was something more: acknowledgement, gratitude, and the unshakable loyalty that had carried him through years of service, in places where such loyalty meant the difference between life and death. Charles inclined his head in response, a small gesture that carried enormous weight. In that moment, the relationship between crown and service was reaffirmed, the principles that sustained the monarchy validated before an audience that would carry the story to every corner of the establishment. Gradually, carefully, conversation began to resume. The French delegation, with the diplomatic skill that had sustained their nation through centuries of upheaval, began discussing cultural exchange programs, as though nothing unusual had occurred. British ministers followed their lead, understanding instinctively that the best service they could render now was to help the evening proceed as normally as possible. The orchestra in the gallery struck tentative notes, then found their rhythm again. Serving staff moved with renewed precision, as though the restoration of order at the royal table had given them permission to resume their duties. The machinery of state dinner protocol ground back into motion, but everyone present understood that something fundamental had changed. The balance of the evening had shifted permanently. Camilla's absence left a space that seemed larger than her physical presence had occupied, a reminder of what happened when the crown's dignity was challenged too directly. James continued his duty with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose integrity had been publicly vindicated. And Charles presided over the remainder of the dinner with an authority that had been tested and proven genuine. When the final course was served, when the last toast had been offered and accepted, when the French delegation had expressed their gratitude for British hospitality, the guests began their carefully choreographed departure. But the conversations that would follow, in embassy cars and government offices, in newspaper editorial rooms and military clubs, would focus not on trade agreements or cultural initiatives, but on the night a queen forgot her place and a king remembered his duty. James remained at his post until the last guest had departed, until the chandeliers were dimmed and the doors secured. Only then did he allow himself to relax from attention, to feel the weight of what had occurred. His jaw still bore the faint mark of the slap, but it had become something more than evidence of assault. It was proof of dignity under pressure, of service that transcended personal insult. Later, much later, when the palace was quiet and the night shift had taken their posts, he would write his report in the careful language required by military protocol, But no official document could capture what had really happened in that ballroom, the moment when the crown chose principle over convenience, when a king discovered that his duty extended beyond diplomacy to the very people who made the monarchy possible. The story would spread through the ranks of the household division like wildfire, told and retold until it became legend. Not the story of a queen who lost control, but of a guardsman who kept his, and of a king who proved that the crown still meant something when it mattered most. Some knights change everything they touch, and sometimes the most important victories are won not through action, but through the quiet strength to endure whatever comes, secure in the knowledge that truth and duty will eventually prevail. What do you think? Did Corporal Ainsley make the right choice by staying silent, even after being struck in front of the entire hall? And was King Charles right to humiliate Camilla publicly in that moment, or should he have dealt with it behind closed doors? If this story opened your eyes to what really happened in that ballroom, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more investigations into the moments that reshape the monarchy. Share this with anyone who believes in standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything. Because, as we've seen tonight, sometimes the greatest strength comes from knowing when not to fight back. Now, there's another story waiting for you right on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that dignity isn't about the crown you wear, but about the character you show when everything falls apart.